name is Ray Kahmeyer. I live here in Lindsborg, and I'm a potter. And I've been asked to demonstrate some of the aspects of making pots in connection with the exhibition upcoming at an exhibition which I'm happy to share with Robert Gear of Newton, who's showing his prints. I will begin by quickly just wedging this clay and then make a pot so one can see how the various processes work. Clay has to be wedged to get the air bubbles out of it and to make sure that the clay is uniform and consistent throughout its makeup. If one doesn't do that, there can be difficulties during the making of the pot. This is done by just a spiral, sort of an over revolving spiral method, which moves the clay with its air bubbles from the interior to the exterior, and when they come out on these little layers that can be seen here, under the pressure of my hands, then they break and disappear. There are various ways to wedge, but this is just my way. Okay, when wedging is done, then one puts the clay on the wheel and begin to turn it. The term used for making pots is throwing. There's several different theories about where that word comes from. The one I like best is the one that says that it comes from the medieval English word Thrown, I believe was the spelling, which means to revolve. The first thing that has to be done is the clay centered, and that's what I'm doing now. Bring the clay up, push it back down, and while it's in motion, I will try and guide the whole mass to center so it revolves smoothly. Now when that's done, then by finding the center and pushing straight down, an opening is made and then enlarged. Trying to keep the clay centered throughout the whole process, because if it ever gets very far out of center, it's almost impossible to recenter it, and in that case the pot will probably collapse. Now at this point I'm going to make a bowl, so at this point, with the hand inside and one outside pushing against each other, I'll just raise that pressure. As you can see, the pot is growing in size. Now it's just a matter of repeating that process several times, and while that's happening, the form is evolving, emerging. So I want to pay attention to what that form's going to be like. Water has to be used all the time for lubrication, because without it, the clay would probably be torn off. Developing the form is just a matter of controlling the direction of the hands as they come up. Now that's about the limit of thickness or thinness. Maybe one more time. But if I keep doing this beyond the point where I should stop, the pot will fall, because if the walls get too thin, they can't support themselves then. Now one can take little wooden tools called ribs, and you can see the surface, the exterior surface is really marked where my fingers have dug into the clay and smooth it. I tend to smooth the pots because I do brush work on a lot of my work, and I like to have a smooth surface for that. Now there's pressure on the clay from the inside hand. As you see the form change slightly, it's because I'm pushing with the inside hand. Take the water out of the interior. I spend some effort when I make bowls trying to get the interior fairly smooth, because most bowls are used with spoons and ladles, which don't work very well if the surface is rough over which they move. Which is what I was just doing. Now that's a pretty ho-hum kind of bowl at this point. So I want to try and do something that makes it perhaps a little more attractive, or has a little better presence than just kind of a generic bowl. Now, potter's wheel, by its nature, makes things that are round, obviously, and there's no reason for anybody to think that round is better than anything else, that we can't do something with this. To make it unround. Now I've taken it out of the round into a kind of almost an ovoid shape, and to emphasize that, I can push my thumb in at those 2 points. And then later, if I decide, I can add handles here, which gives this area kind of an anchoring point for those handles. That's about as much as I can do with the form at this point. What I'll do is cut it loose with this little wire. Now if I were to try to lift that fairly good sized pot off of there, if it didn't collapse, it would at least distort. So I have a system here where I lift the pots off on that plywood disc without any danger of distorting or destroying the pot. Smaller pots can be just cut and lifted off, but when they're that size, it's rare that one can do that. Now, once a pot is made and air dried for a time, then it has to be turned over and the bottom finished. As you can see, the bottom of this is very, very unfinished, looking very much like the bottom of that one. So I need to turn this upside down now and carve away the clay that I don't want. It's too thick, it's too unfinished. So I'll put it upside down on the wheel and center it, and then stick it down with some little wads of clay. Then, to help hold it down while I'm carving on it, I use a jar lid. Now these simple little tools that I've made, I'll just begin to cut away some of the clay. You can see it coming off in those shavings. See, with that jar lid on there now, I can press down quite hard and help hold the upside down pot to the wheel so it doesn't slide around. You can also see that the thumb on my left hand is anchored on the right hand. That helps stabilize what I'm doing with the trimming tool. One has to know how much clay is available there for carving away, or one can certainly end up suddenly with a hole through the wall of the pot. Now, so that the pot will rest with stability and in a level way, cut away the excess clay here in the center and end up with this ring of clay that you see here that potters call a foot ring. Sometimes you can tap the clay and get a sense of the thickness. Just about as far as I can go, judging from the sound. See, all this is excess. Now, this clay, when it dries, these scraps can just be put in water and recycled, so it's not wasted by any means. I can remove these little wads. And there's the bowl. I don't sign my work. I use a little stamp with the initial K and just press that, usually, unless I forget, into this pot somewhere. I personally don't think signature is very important. Anyway, it's it's the pot that ought to make the difference, not the signature. Okay, that's, in a very quick way, that's the process of throwing and trimming. These things now have to be air dried thoroughly and then put in the kiln and fired, taken out, the glaze applied, and then fired again. And what we'll do next then is I'll show you very quickly a glazing process. Okay, I'd said earlier that once a pot is finished and trimmed and dried, it has to be put in the kiln and fired. That firing is called a bisque firing, and when the pots come out, they look like this. See, there's some ring to them. They're permanently hard, but it's at this point then that we have to put some glaze on, and I'll show you now at this time how I do that. There are lots of ways to apply glazes, so what I'm showing you is not going to be just the only way. I will put some hot wax on the bottom of this pot so that when I glaze it, the glaze will not attach itself to the bottom, because if it did that, then in the kiln that glaze would melt too and it would stick to the kiln shelf and ruin the pot and damage the kiln shelf. So I just brush the hot wax on the bottom. Okay, that's enough. Now, my glazes I keep over here in these large crocks, and they've been standing for several days without use, so I have to stir them now. And by gripping the pot with the tongs like this, I can put it in the glaze for about 7 seconds. That time varies widely depending on which glazes you're using and how you're using them and so forth. See, the glaze is very wet, very shiny. Now if I touch it, it would mar it, scar it. So I set it down and give it just a few minutes to air dry. And while that's doing, it's drying, I'll stir the other glaze, because I want to put another glaze on top of that with some wax work between them. This is a variation of an ancient Japanese glaze that's referred to as a Shino glaze, developed in the 1600s in Japan. Very interesting glaze. It was sort of rediscovered by accident by a student at the University of Minnesota a few years ago, and is now used by many, many, many potters. Okay, now this is not quite as dry as it should be, dry enough to handle carefully. Okay, now then, if I brush a pattern on here with hot wax, wherever that pattern is, when I put this into the glaze that I just stirred, because there's wax there in 3 different places, this next glaze will not attach. So we'll see the contrast of the 2 glazes. See, perhaps you could see the glaze crawl off of those waxed areas. It's a very interesting way to use glazes and separate them in that way. So I find it interesting. There are many different ways to apply glazes. As I said earlier, one can spray them, brush them, pour them, or dip them. I dip most of mine, but all those other ways are used by. Okay, we're outside now, so you'll have a chance to see some of the features of the kiln. As I told you inside a few minutes ago, the pots have to be fired in order to melt that glaze that you saw applied. The temperature that glaze melts at is roughly just a few degrees under 2400 degrees Fahrenheit. The kiln is not that hot at this point, but will become hotter as the day goes on. It takes about 16 hours of firing to get to that near 2400 degrees. I measure the temperature by inserting into the kiln, as it's loaded, small devices called pyrometric cones, which melt at certain temperatures. That's how I know how hot the kiln is. Looking in now at those cones, I can see that the one that melts at 1940 degrees has been bent over and melted for some time. So I would guess the kiln is just now at around 2000 degrees. So it's got nearly 400 degrees yet to rise, and the longer it fires, the hotter it gets, but the harder those degrees are to come by. That's why it takes so much longer to get the last 400 than the first 400. But by about 10:30 or 11 tonight, it should be finished.